Tuning in yet again. Today I just wanted to make a relatively quick one to talk about the Airman Certification Standards. So I've gotten a lot of insights recently that there's quite a few people who are unsure what the ACS is, unsure how to use it, and things like that. So before I progressed on to making more videos, I want to show you kind of what I base my content off of, and where some of these topics come from. So I am on the FAA's website. Sorry, my screen is kind of positioned a little bit weird, but I'm on the FAA's website. It actually is faa.gov/training testing ACS. So the Airman Certification Standards is essentially a document put out by the FAA to help pilots be successful. Right? It's like, it's almost like a course syllabus in a way. So, for instance, if you remember back to high school, English class, and you showed up on day one, and the teacher said, okay, here is what to expect, here is what we're doing, and here's what you're graded on, the objectives. That's what the ACS is. It's what you're graded on, what you're supposed to be taught, what you're supposed to be studying, and what you're going to be tested on. How to successfully pass your check ride. So let's briefly talk about what a check ride is. So a check ride is essentially a 2-part test that every single pilot has to go through in order to get certified. So it initially starts out, you do your training, you train with your instructor, you build upon those foundational skills. Your instructor deems you what we call proficient, which means you're to standards, hint, standards, and you are competent enough to pass the check ride. So the check ride is a 2-part test. So the first part entails you going through an oral evaluation. So this part is where they ask you various questions about ground knowledge. And we're going to look at the different subjects regarding ground knowledge here in a second. Then the second part is flight. So you'll actually go up in your airplane and fly with the DPE, the examiner, and he or she will ask you to demonstrate different maneuvers. Okay, so let's talk about a DPE for a second. A DPE is a designated pilot examiner, and essentially a DPE is a certified examiner that will come out, and they've been appointed by the FAA to conduct and administer these check rides. You can also do a check ride with the FAA, or if you're in a 141 program, a chief flight instructor who has undergone certain certification standards may be able to do your check ride as well. Alright, so let's get into the ACS itself. So we can see that there's a few links here, frequently answered or frequently asked questions that might be something that you want to check out prior to diving into your ACS. So there's different levels. If you're unfamiliar with the levels of training, you usually start out as a student pilot. There's not an ACS for that because anybody can get their student pilot certificate. They can get it right now if they wanted. And then you move up through private pilot. You get your private pilot's license here. You get your instrument rating generally next. You get your commercial pilot after that. And then if you want to shoot for the big dogs, the airline transport pilot. So that's what you use to become an actual airline pilot. And you'll notice you want to pay attention to what category of aircraft, because there's airplane or rotorcraft or helicopter, you want to stick with airplane if you're going with airplane. There's also powered lift, and look at AMTs have one too. There is also a remote pilot. That's another story for another day. All right. And flight instructor, wherever those ones are. I'm not going to spend time looking for them. But we're going to go off of private pilot for now. So this is our private pilot Airman Certification Standards. This number up here is just the reference number for the FAA's book. Okay, so this just talks about the revisions, so we're going to kind of go through this together. They have added these codes, and we'll talk about the codes here in a second. All right, so let's look at the table of contents to preface this for a second, and then we'll dive into each individual section. So we have different areas of operation. So these can be kind of defined as chapters. So this is chapter 1 of the book. You have to talk about pre-flight preparation, right? And then there's all of these subjects in here. You got pilot qualifications, weather, operations of systems. You've got your chapter 2 or area of operation 2 pre-flight procedures. You will be assessed on these, I wouldn't call them maneuvers, but knowledge areas here. Airport seaplane-based operations, so communications, light and signals, runway lighting systems, and then traffic patterns. Area of operation 4, takeoffs, landings, and go-arounds. These are your actual maneuvers that you're conducting in flight. So we're going to have to do a normal takeoff and landing with then a short field takeoff and landing, a soft field takeoff and landing. And then you'll notice there's different kind of like abbreviations here, like ACEL, AMEL. So ACEL here, airplane single engine land, airplane single engine land. Okay, so you have to demonstrate a soft field takeoff and climb on your airplane single engine land checkride. So for instance, I'm getting my private pilot in a Cirrus SR-20. I have to do a soft field takeoff and landing. Okay, now we come down here. Short field takeoff and landing says ACEL and AMEL. So if I'm taking my check ride in a Cirrus SR-20, airplane single engine land, I have to do a short field takeoff and landing. If I'm taking my check ride in a Beechcraft Baron, that's an airplane multi-engine land. I also have to do a short field takeoff and landing. Okay, and then we come down here to confined area takeoff and maximum performance climb. That doesn't apply to us unless if you're taking your check ride in an airplane single engine C or an airplane multi-engine C. So you kind of have to pick and choose through these and go, okay, well, this applies to me and this doesn't. So for your airplane single engine land, regardless, you have to do a normal, a short field, or a soft field and a short field. And then the rest of these down here are for seaplanes. So single engine C and multi-engine C. Okay, so performance maneuvers and ground reference maneuvers. You got steep turns and ground reference maneuvers. And then navigation. They're going to analyze your ability to navigate from point to point, kind of like across country. And then your slow flight installs. So again, more maneuvers. And then basic instrument maneuvers, more maneuvers. They have to make sure that you're able to operate safely if you were to get into what we call inadvertent IMC, or inadvertent instrument meteorological conditions. Now we have emergency operations. So, specifically, it's important, obviously, that a pilot knows how to handle anything that's thrown at them. And the first thing starts with handling emergency operations. So, We're tested on them. We're held to a standard. And then again, multi-engine operations, this whole VMC thing, multi-engine. Okay, and then yes, night operations, and then your post-flight procedures. So I just kind of want to briefly go through this. I don't want to jump into it super in depth because I think it's a pretty boring document overall. But once you understand how each of the sections work, you're able to study and understand the rest of the document. So we're going to first look at pilot qualifications here. So area of operation 1, pre-flight preparation, pilot qualifications. Okay, so the objective here, make sure you read the objectives. I know the objectives are pretty boring and a lot of people don't typically read them, but I highly encourage you because they sometimes give a little bit more insight than what these things do down here. So, you've got 3 sections here, okay? So, starting with knowledge. So, you have to demonstrate an understanding of all of these things. Now, you notice these codes here. Generally speaking, so for private pilot, instrument, commercial, ATP, flight instructor ratings, your initial ratings, licenses, you have to take a written test. Now, this FAA written is designed to measure these knowledge areas, risk management areas, and skill areas. So each question on those written tests correspond with one of these codes. So let's say I go and take the private pilot written, I got a 90%, we'll just say that, 70% passing, and by the way, those tests are only valid for 2 years, so be conscious of that. But anyways, so I got a 90%, and I missed PAIA K2, privileges and limitations. So I missed a question that has to do with the privileges and limitations of a private pilot. So on my Checkride, I'm going to be asked, what are the privileges and limitations of a private pilot? And that's when I would say, okay, well, we can act as pilot in command. We can fly as we want, fly as we please. We can fly at night. We can fly by ourselves. Limitations, obviously we can't get paid, right? So I would ramble on about that and reference the FAR and talk about that. So that's how that works. And these codes are put on what we call the AKTR, or the Airman Knowledge Test Report. It's a piece of paper that the testing center examiner will, or proctor, I guess, the testing center proctor will give to you when you're done. It has your score and these codes. Alright, so you also have to explain or have a knowledge of all of these other things. Now, risk management, so typically on a Checkride, a lot of these last 2 sections are built into a scenario. Like, they may say, okay, so you do your training in a Cessna 172 that's, a 6-pack from the 60s, and you want to go out and fly a Cirrus SR-20 that has an all-glass cockpit. What do you do, right? And that pretty much covers almost all of these, right? So you'd say, okay, well, proficiency, I might not feel as comfortable because obviously the G1000 with the Cirrus is a very, very complex system. It's very complicated. And it's not really complicated, but it's complicated to someone who's flown a 6-pack their whole life. But currency-wise, yeah, I do meet the takeoff and landings. I've had, 10 takeoff and landings within the past 90 days. So I'm good there. But proficiency-wise, I would want to go up with a flight instructor. Flying an unfamiliar aircraft, right? I don't know how a Cirrus flies. I don't have my high performance endorsement to fly that. And then they'll build off of that and say, okay, well, you got your training done. Now let's talk about acting as PIC under VFR. So the TAF shows that it's, 5 miles of visibility. Clouds are at 5,000 feet. How would you feel about that? So the examiner isn't just going to ask you blatant questions. Like, sure, they might ask you blatant questions about things you miss, like privileges and limitations. But a lot of these things here are going to be built into some sort of scenario. Especially down here when it comes to airworthiness requirements. They may say, okay, well, you have when we talk about this in operative equipment, they may say, okay, well, you have alternator 1 is not working. So how do you go about that? Right? So, and then you reference 91.213, and then you go through the whole flow that's outlined in that FAR. So, as I mentioned earlier, these are pretty much all of your ground knowledge standards that you're tested to. And the formatting is the same, but a lot of this is built into a scenario. So if you can run scenarios in your head, the more you do that, the more better off you'll be. Yeah, so let's continue on. Let's kind of get out of chapter 1 here. Alright, so moving on to areas of operations 2, pre-flight procedures. So this is pretty much where you walk around the aircraft. Now, a lot of times they'll ask you questions about this, of course, in the ground portion. But this also is something that they watch you do, right? So they're going to watch you do a pre-flight and make sure that you're inspecting everything, you're giving a brief. I like to include all of these in a brief. Yeah, so again, it's this exact same format as the other sections. And every time you start an engine, yes, it's on the ACS. Yes, they're making sure that you're doing that safely. Okay, so I'm just going to keep scrolling through here. Area of Operations 3. This is also kind of integrated into the ground. I've had it mixed before in a way. But yes, they are evaluating this while you're flying. So traffic patterns, of course, you're going to be doing traffic patterns while you're doing the landing section, which I believe is next. Yep. So as you're doing your landings and takeoffs, they're going to analyze, okay, well, how is this person's traffic pattern awareness? Now, as we get into the maneuvers here, you'll notice that they kind of walk you through the steps on how to do it. So I'm going to find a good one here. Not soft field. I'm looking for a short field. Okay, so short field approach and landing. These are the things that they want to see here, okay? They want to see you have a stabilized approach, including energy management concepts. Effects of atmospheric conditions, including wind on approach and landing performance, right? So, if I have a gust, for both of these, if I have a gust factor, I'm gonna increase my approach speed, right? You want to build up that speed so you don't stall, obviously. So, if you're flying on a windy day, like for instance, if it has a gust factor of 10, you should probably add 5-ish knots, or whatever your aircraft book POH recommends, or airplane, or the flying manual recommends, because you want a safety buffer, right? So the examiner wants to see that you're doing that. They want to see that you have an understanding of selection of runway based on pilot capability, airplane performance, and limitations, available distance, and wind. Again, these are justifying your actions, justifying why you're doing what you're doing when you're doing it. That sounds complicated, but literally just being able to justify what the crap you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it, when you're doing it, that is amazing. But they want you to have an understanding of these things. So here's more of the maneuver itself. So complete the appropriate checklist, make radio calls as appropriate, ensure the airplane is aligned with the correct or assigned runway, scan the landing runway and adjoining area for traffic and obstructions, right? So we always yell out cleared, area clear, or traffic clear, base clear. So anytime I'm doing a turn in the traffic pattern, I'm always saying, before I even turn, crosswind clear. Then I'm dip the wing, make my radio call. Turning downwind clear, dip the wing, make my radio call. Every single leg of the traffic pattern, I'm verbalizing, okay, it's clear, I don't see any traffic. Select and aim for a suitable touchdown point, considering the wind conditions, landing surface, and obstructions. Generally speaking, we like to aim for the 1,000-footers. I call them the Lego bricks. Some people call them the pancakes, but I call them the Lego bricks. Establish the recommend approach and landing configuration, airspeed, and trim, and adjust pitch, altitude, and power as required to maintain a stabilized approach. Maintain manufacturer's published approach speed, or in its absence, not more than 1.3 VSO plus 10 minus 5 knots with a gust factor applied. So this is giving you speed tolerances. So you can go 10 knots over, 5 knots under. So you have a buffer of pretty much 15 knots-ish here. But, so you want to stay within that standard. Maintaining directional control and appropriate crosswind correction throughout the approach and landing. Make smooth, timely, and correct control application before, during, and after touchdown. Touchdown at a proper pitch attitude within 200 feet beyond or on the specified point. Okay. Threshold markings or runway numbers with no side drift, minimum float, and with the airplane's longitudinal axis aligned over the runway center line. Okay. And then obviously, proper configuration, execute a go-around, and runway incursions. So it's giving you a distance standard as well. And you'll notice that one of the biggest things that I wish I had dug a little deeper on when I was in private pilot are these standards. Because knowing your standards will help you a lot during commercial. If you can tighten your standards to 100 feet beyond, commercial will be that much easier, because the standard, I believe, is 100 feet. Okay? So you'll notice that as you get into maneuvers, they're going to actually give you more slimmed down standards. So I'm looking for another one here really quick. Yes, forward slip to a landing. They will make you do one of those. So make sure touchdown within 400 feet beyond. Okay. So you got to make sure that you understand these standards before jumping into training. Because this is how you pass your test here. Okay, so steep turns. Again, knowledge areas, risk management areas. So yes, they can fail you on uncoordinated flight. They can fail you on overbanking the aircraft. Okay, so here's what you're held to. Clear the area. Cool. Establish the manufacturer's recommended airspeed or if one is not available, an airspeed not to exceed exceed the maneuvering speed VA. So roll into a coordinated 360 degree steep turn with approximately 45 degrees bank. Okay. Alright, so you have to go to 45. Perform the task in the opposite direction as specified by the evaluator. Maintain entry altitude plus or minus 100 feet. Cool. So you have plus or minus 100 feet. Airspeed, plus or minus 10 knots. Bank, plus or minus 5 degrees. And roll out on entry heading, plus or minus 10 degrees. So you have a standard for 4 things here. You have a standard for altitude, airspeed, bank, and heading. So just watch out for that. Again, this is why knowing your standards helps, because then you know, okay, well, what can I do to help make this better? So now we have ground reference maneuvers. This is task B, and they're going to say pretty much the same thing, except these give you what we call a deck of altitude. At least that's what I call it, a deck of altitude. So for rectangular course, we have 600 to 1,000 feet above the ground level at an appropriate distance, right? So it's saying, okay, your deck is between 600 and 1,000 feet. So I like to imagine, if you've ever heard of an air show block. So anytime that there's an air show, they will actually block out that airspace. So they'll say aerobatics happening between 600 and 1,000 feet. So that's our block altitude. That's what these are. So you want to maintain your block altitude between 600 and 1,000 feet. Cool. So you want to enter, I usually do these at 800 just because it feels really comfortable. And I have 200 feet on either side. Because if I go to 600 feet and dip below 600, I fail. If I start at 1,000 feet and I dip above 1,000 feet, I fail. Now, would I argue that there's certain times that you would want to start these at a higher altitude? Possibly, but you want to go with what the standards say, right? And then, again, down here, you also have wind drift. So you got to correct for wind drift, but altitude plus or minus 100 feet, airspeed plus or minus 10 knots. Okay, so it looks like that's pretty much the only numbered standard there, but you want to be careful when doing things like this. Now for your dead reckoning and pilotage situation, same thing. You have standards, plus or minus 200 feet with a heading of plus or minus 15 degrees. So, it is okay to go plus or minus 15, but try to stay plus or minus 5. It's okay to go plus or minus 200 feet, but try to stay plus or minus 100, right? So that's pretty much that section. And then same thing with the lost procedures. There's not really a numbered standard on this, but you're doing your appropriate course of action or whatever flow you run through to hit all of these points here. Now, I wanted to touch on slow flight installs. I know that this ACS tour is probably fairly boring. However, it's very important that every pilot understands the skills that they need to possess. So, slow flight installs. This is slow flight, yes. Cool. Now, clear the area, select an entry altitude that allows the task to be completed no lower than 1,500 feet above the ground. So that's our hard deck. We cannot go below 1,500 feet. So would I start this at 1,500 feet? Absolutely never not. Never. Don't ever do that. I would probably start this at 1,700 feet. Because if we look down here, specified altitude plus or minus 100 feet, right? So if the examiner allows you to choose your altitude, heck yeah, I'm going with 1,700. Just because I can dip down to 1,600, or dip up to 1,600, I can dip down to 1,400. But do I want to do that? Absolutely not. Establish and maintain an airspeed at which any further increase of angle of attack will basically result in a stall. Warning. Coordinated straight and level flight turns, climbs, and descents. Maintain the specified altitude plus or minus 100. Specified altitude plus or minus 10. Airspeed plus 10 minus 0. So, yeah. Slow flight is a little tricky. So say my speed is 65 knots. Okay, so I don't want to dip below that 65. I can't dip below that 65. But I can go to 75. Am I going to go to 75? Absolutely not. And specified angle of a bank, plus or minus 10 degrees. Now, stalls are a bit interesting here. Again, no lower than 1,500 feet. That's my hard deck. This is a power off stall. Yeah, power off stall. Again, you want to follow the standards here. And I wanted to see, let's see. I could have swore it said with minimal altitude loss. Maybe that's in the commercial ACS. Maybe that's in the commercial ACS. Maybe I'm just making things up, but try to recover with as little altitude loss as you possibly can with a stall. Obviously, maintain specified heading plus or minus 10. Maintain specified angle of a bank not to exceed 20 degrees plus or minus 10. If in turning flight while inducing the stall. Okay. So again, power on stalls are pretty much the same thing here. Spin awareness, they will be analyzing that as well. Basic instrument maneuvers, I think this is the last section. Your instrument skills will be, you'll have to wear the foggles during your check ride, a portion of it, and you will be asked to fly straight and level, do some constant airspeed climbs and descents, all those fun things. And you still have standards plus or minus 200, heading plus or minus 20, airspeed plus or minus 10. Constant airspeed climbs, altitude plus or minus 200, plus or minus 20, plus or minus 10, right? So, I really wanted to do this video to emphasize the importance of the ACS, right? Because if we don't know our standards, if we don't know the syllabus, we're not going to pass the class, okay? And that's why as a university college student, I can 100,000% say with a surety that students who read the syllabus for the course they're taking has a higher chance of success. They know what to prepare for. They know what to study for. They know that, hey, I'm going to have to write a 12-page essay. In one of my classes, I had to write a 24-page essay. So it's like, okay, I know what to anticipate. I can go, all right, I have to write a 24-page essay. So I can start brainstorming now, or I can procrastinate it, right? You want to try to meet standards quickly, not when it's too late the day before your check ride, or if not at all. Now, the ACS is, sure, it's pretty strict, but if you train super hard, the ACS is actually really easy. The last I was wrong. The last area of operation is emergency operations. Yes, you do still have standards. Absolutely. On your emergency descent, bank angle between 30 and 45 degrees. Positive load factors during the descent. Appropriate airspeed plus 0, minus 10 knots, and level off at a specified altitude plus or minus 100 feet. So that's saying, like, if I say, okay, my airspeed's 140 knots, that's what we're doing. I can't go above 140, but I can go below by 10 knots. But am I going to do that? No, I'm going to try to stay at 140. Now, if you hit like 141, 142, actively verbalize it and make the corrections to fix it now. So regardless of the maneuver, you're going to have standards. And one of my biggest tips is to write down the standards on like a little note card and tape it somewhere in the airplane. Tape it somewhere where you can see it. And every time you go to do a maneuver during your training phase, call out the standards that you're held to. Then that way on your check ride, you take the sign down and you know your standards. Okay. So that's pretty much all I have for the ACS. Again, just to recap here. Sorry, this is a lot of scrolling. So just to recap here, we talked about the general consensus of why the ACS is important and why every single pilot needs to know the ACS, regardless of their situation here. There are multiple ACSs out there. Make sure that you get the up-to-date, the current one, and go off of that. Make sure your instructor has an adequate knowledge of the ACS. If your instructor does not, that is definitely a red flag prior to starting training. Please look at the ACS. I know this video was a little bit longer than I anticipated it to be, but I cannot stress enough, please, please, please review your syllabus, the ACS. Anywho, thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more educational content.